KaraokeBooks.
Poetics. Aristotle. Translated by Samuel Henry Butcher. Audiobook. Chapter 22. The perfection of style is to be clear without being mean. The clearest style is that which uses only current or proper words. At the same time it is mean. Witness the poetry of Cleophon and of Sthenelus. That diction, on the other hand, is lofty and raised above the commonplace which employs unusual words. By unusual, I mean strange, or rare, words, metaphorical, lengthened, anything, in short, that differs from the normal idiom. Yet a style wholly composed of such words is either a riddle or a jargon. A riddle, if it consists of metaphors; a jargon, if it consists of strange, or rare, words. For the essence of a riddle is to express true facts under impossible combinations. Now this cannot be done by any arrangement of ordinary words, but by the use of metaphor it can. Such is the riddle. A man I saw who on another man had glued the bronze by aid of fire, and others of the same kind. A diction that is made up of strange, or rare, terms is a jargon. A certain infusion, therefore, of these elements is necessary to style. For the strange, or rare, word, the metaphorical, the ornamental, and the other kinds above mentioned, will raise it above the commonplace and mean, while the use of proper words will make it perspicuous. But nothing contributes more to produce a clearness of diction that is remote from commonness than the lengthening, contraction, and alteration of words. For by deviating in exceptional cases from the normal idiom, the language will gain distinction, while, at the same time, the partial conformity with usage will give perspicuity. The critics, therefore, are in error who censure these licenses of speech, and hold the author up to ridicule. Thus Eucleides, the elder, declared that it would be an easy matter to be a poet if you might lengthen syllables at will. He caricatured the practice in the very form of his diction, as in the verse: epsilon pi iota chi alpha rho eta nu, epsilon iota delta omicron nu, mu alpha rho alpha theta omega nu alpha delta epsilon, beta alpha delta iota zeta omicron nu tau alpha, or omicron upsilon kappa, alpha nu, gamma, epsilon rho alpha mu epsilon nu omicron sigma, tau omicron nu, epsilon kappa epsilon iota nu omicron upsilon, epsilon lambda lambda epsilon beta omicron rho omicron nu. To employ such license at all obtrusively is, no doubt, grotesque, but in any mode of poetic diction there must be moderation. Even metaphors, strange, or rare, words, or any similar forms of speech, would produce the like effect if used without propriety and with the express purpose of being ludicrous. How great a difference is made by the appropriate use of lengthening, may be seen in epic poetry by the insertion of ordinary forms in the verse. So, again, if we take a strange, or rare, word, a metaphor, or any similar mode of expression, and replace it by the current or proper term, the truth of our observation will be manifest. For example, Aeschylus and Euripides each composed the same iambic line. But the alteration of a single word by Euripides, who employed the rarer term instead of the ordinary one, makes one verse appear beautiful and the other trivial. Aeschylus in his Philoctetes says, phi alpha gamma epsilon delta alpha iota nu alpha, delta, eta, mu omicron upsilon, sigma alpha rho kappa alpha sigma, epsilon rho theta iota epsilon iota, pi omicron delta omicron sigma. Euripides substitutes theta omicron iota nu alpha tau alpha iota, feasts on, for epsilon sigma theta iota epsilon iota, feeds on. Again, in the line, nu upsilon nu, delta epsilon, mu, epsilon omega nu, omicron lambda iota gamma upsilon sigma, tau epsilon, kappa alpha iota, omicron upsilon tau iota delta alpha nu omicron sigma, kappa alpha iota, alpha epsilon iota kappa eta sigma. The difference will be felt if we substitute the common words nu upsilon nu, delta epsilon, mu, epsilon omega nu, mu iota kappa rho omicron sigma, tau epsilon, kappa alpha iota, alpha rho theta epsilon nu iota kappa omicron sigma, kappa alpha iota, alpha epsilon iota delta gamma sigma. Or, if for the line, delta iota phi rho omicron nu, alpha epsilon iota kappa epsilon lambda iota omicron nu, kappa alpha tau alpha theta epsilon iota sigma, omicron lambda iota gamma eta nu, tau epsilon, tau rho alpha pi epsilon iota sigma, omicron lambda iota gamma eta nu, tau epsilon, tau rho alpha pi epsilon zeta alpha nu. We read, delta iota phi rho omicron nu, mu omicron chi theta eta rho omicron nu, kappa alpha tau alpha theta epsilon iota sigma, mu iota kappa rho alpha nu, tau epsilon, tau rho alpha pi epsilon zeta alpha nu. Or, for eta iota omicron nu epsilon sigma, beta omicron omega rho iota nu, eta iota omicron nu epsilon sigma kappa rho alpha zeta omicron upsilon rho iota nu. Again, Ariphrades ridiculed the tragedians for using phrases which no one would employ in ordinary speech. For example, delta omega mu alpha tau omega nu, alpha pi omicron, instead of alpha pi omicron, delta omega mu alpha tau omega nu, rho epsilon theta epsilon nu, epsilon gamma omega, delta epsilon, nu iota nu, alpha chi iota lambda lambda epsilon omega sigma, pi epsilon rho iota. Instead of pi epsilon rho iota, alpha chi iota lambda lambda epsilon omega sigma, and the like. It is precisely because such phrases are not part of the current idiom that they give distinction to the style. This, however, he failed to see. It is a great matter to observe propriety in these several modes of expression, as also in compound words, strange, or rare, words, and so forth. But the greatest thing by far is to have a command of metaphor. This alone cannot be imparted by another. It is the mark of genius, for to make good metaphors implies an eye for resemblances. Of the various kinds of words, the compound are best adapted to dithyrambs, rare words to heroic poetry, metaphors to iambic. In heroic poetry, indeed, all these varieties are serviceable. But in iambic verse, which reproduces, as far as may be, familiar speech, the most appropriate words are those which are found even in prose. These are, the current or proper, the metaphorical, the ornamental. Concerning tragedy and imitation by means of action this may suffice. Chapter 23. As to that poetic imitation which is narrative in form and employs a single meter, the plot manifestly ought, as in a tragedy, to be constructed on dramatic principles. It should have for its subject a single action, whole and complete, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It will thus resemble a living organism in all its unity, and produce the pleasure proper to it. It will differ in structure from historical compositions, which of necessity present not a single action, but a single period, and all that happened within that period to one person or to many, little connected together as the events may be. For as the sea fight at Salamis and the battle with the Carthaginians in Sicily took place at the same time, but did not tend to any one result, so in the sequence of events, one thing sometimes follows another, and yet no single result is thereby produced. Such is the practice, we may say, of most poets. Here again, then, as has been already observed, the transcendent excellence of Homer is manifest. He never attempts to make the whole war of Troy the subject of his poem, though that war had a beginning and an end. It would have been too vast a theme, and not easily embraced in a single view. If, again, he had kept it within moderate limits, it must have been overcomplicated by the variety of the incidents. As it is, he detaches a single portion, and admits as episodes many events from the general story of the war, such as the catalogue of the ships and others, thus diversifying the poem. All other poets take a single hero, a single period, or an action single indeed, but with a multiplicity of parts. Thus did the author of the Cypria and of the Little Iliad. For this reason the Iliad and the Odyssey each furnish the subject of one tragedy, or, at most, of two, while the Cypria supplies materials for many, and the Little Iliad for 8. The Award of the Arms, the Philoctetes, the Neoptolemus, the Eurypylus, the Mendicant Odysseus, the Laconian Women, the Fall of Ilium, the Departure of the Fleet. Chapter 24. Again, epic poetry must have as many kinds as tragedy. It must be simple, or complex, or ethical, or pathetic. The parts also, with the exception of song and spectacle, are the same. For it requires reversals of the situation, recognitions, and scenes of suffering. Moreover, the thoughts and the diction must be artistic. In all these respects Homer is our earliest and sufficient model. Indeed, each of his poems has a twofold character. The Iliad is at once simple and pathetic, and the Odyssey complex, for recognition scenes run through it, and at the same time, ethical. Moreover, in diction and thought they are supreme. Epic poetry differs from tragedy in the scale on which it is constructed, and in its meter. As regards scale or length, we have already laid down an adequate limit. The beginning and the end must be capable of being brought within a single view. This condition will be satisfied by poems on a smaller scale than the old epics, and answering in length to the group of tragedies presented at a single sitting. Epic poetry has, however, a special, capacity for enlarging its dimensions, and we can see the reason. In tragedy we cannot imitate several lines of actions carried on at one and the same time. We must confine ourselves to the action on the stage and the part taken by the players. But in epic poetry, owing to the narrative form, many events simultaneously transacted can be presented, and these, if relevant to the subject, add mass and dignity to the poem. The epic has here an advantage, and one that conduces to grandeur of effect, to diverting the mind of the hearer, and relieving the story with varying episodes. For sameness of incident soon produces satiety, and makes tragedies fail on the stage. As for the meter, the heroic measure has proved its fitness by the test of experience. If a narrative poem in any other meter or in many meters were now composed, it would be found incongruous. For of all measures the heroic is the stateliest and the most massive, and hence it most readily admits rare words and metaphors, which is another point in which the narrative form of imitation stands alone. On the other hand, the iambic and the trochaic tetrameter are stirring measures, the latter being akin to dancing, the former expressive of action. Still more absurd would it be to mix together different meters, as was done by Kerman. Hence no one has ever composed a poem on a great scale in any other than heroic verse. Nature herself, as we have said, teaches the choice of the proper measure. Homer, admirable in all respects, has the special merit of being the only poet who rightly appreciates the part he should take himself. The poet should speak as little as possible in his own person, for it is not this that makes him an imitator. Other poets appear themselves upon the scene throughout, and imitate but little and rarely. Homer, after a few prefatory words, at once brings in a man, or woman, or other personage, none of them wanting in characteristic qualities, but each with a character of his own. The element of the wonderful is required in tragedy. The irrational, on which the wonderful depends for its chief effects, has wider scope in epic poetry, because there the person acting is not seen. Thus, the pursuit of Hector would be ludicrous if placed upon the stage, the Greeks standing still and not joining in the pursuit, and Achilles waving them back. But in the epic poem the absurdity passes unnoticed. Now the wonderful is pleasing, as may be inferred from the fact that everyone tells a story with some addition of his own, knowing that his hearers like it. It is Homer who has chiefly taught other poets the art of telling lies skillfully. The secret of it lies in a fallacy, for, assuming that if one thing is or becomes, a second is or becomes, men imagine that, if the second is, the first likewise is or becomes. But this is a false inference. Hence, where the first thing is untrue, it is quite unnecessary, provided the second be true, to add that the first is or has become. For the mind, knowing the second to be true, falsely infers the truth of the first. There is an example of this in the bath scene of the Odyssey. Accordingly, the poet should prefer probable impossibilities to improbable possibilities. The tragic plot must not be composed of irrational parts. Everything irrational should, if possible, be excluded, or, at all events, it should lie outside the action of the play, as, in the Oedipus, the hero's ignorance as to the manner of Laius' death; not within the drama, as in the Electra, the messenger's account of the Pythian games; or, as in the Mysians, the man who has come from Tegea to Mysia and is still speechless. The plea that otherwise the plot would have been ruined, is ridiculous. Such a plot should not in the first instance be constructed. But once the irrational has been introduced and an air of likelihood imparted to it, we must accept it in spite of the absurdity. Take even the irrational incidents in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is left upon the shore of Ithaca. How intolerable even these might have been would be apparent if an inferior poet were to treat the subject. As it is, the absurdity is veiled by the poetic charm with which the poet invests it. The diction should be elaborated in the pauses of the action, where there is no expression of character or thought. For, conversely, character and thought are merely obscured by a diction that is over-brilliant. Chapter 25. With respect to critical difficulties and their solutions, the number and nature of the sources from which they may be drawn may be thus exhibited. The poet, being an imitator, like a painter or any other artist, must of necessity imitate one of three objects: things as they were or are, things as they are said or thought to be, or things as they ought to be. The vehicle of expression is language, either current terms or, it may be, rare words or metaphors. There are also many modifications of language, which we concede to the poets. Add to this, that the standard of correctness is not the same in poetry and politics, any more than in poetry and any other art. Within the art of poetry itself there are two kinds of faults: those which touch its essence, and those which are accidental. If a poet has chosen to imitate something, but has imitated it incorrectly, through want of capacity, the error is inherent in the poetry. But if the failure is due to a wrong choice, if he has represented a horse as throwing out both his off legs at once, or introduced technical inaccuracies in medicine, for example, or in any other art, the error is not essential to the poetry. These are the points of view from which we should consider and answer the objections raised by the critics. First, as to matters which concern the poet's own art. If he describes the impossible, he is guilty of an error. But the error may be justified, if the end of the art be thereby attained. The end being that already mentioned, if, that is, the effect of this or any other part of the poem is thus rendered more striking. A case in point is the pursuit of Hector. If, however, the end might have been as well, or better, attained without violating the special rules of the poetic art, the error is not justified. For every kind of error should, if possible, be avoided. Again, does the error touch the essentials of the poetic art, or some accident of it? For example, not to know that a hind has no horns is a less serious matter than to paint it inartistically. Further, if it be objected that the description is not true to fact, the poet may perhaps reply, but the objects are as they ought to be, just as Sophocles said that he drew men as they ought to be, Euripides, as they are. In this way the objection may be met. If, however, the representation be of neither kind, the poet may answer, "This is how men say the thing is." This applies to tales about the gods. It may well be that these stories are not higher than fact nor yet true to fact. They are, very possibly, what Xenophon says of them. But anyhow, this is what is said. Again, a description may be no better than the fact. Still, it was the fact, as in the passage about the arms. Upright upon their butt ends stood the spears. This was the custom then, as it now is among the Illyrians. Again, in examining whether what has been said or done by someone is poetically right or not, we must not look merely to the particular act or saying, and ask whether it is poetically good or bad. We must also consider by whom it is said or done, to whom, when, by what means, or for what end. Whether, for instance, it be to secure a greater good, or avert a greater evil. Other difficulties may be resolved by due regard to the usage of language. We may note a rare word, as in omicron upsilon rho eta alpha sigma, mu epsilon nu, pi rho omega tau omicron nu, where the poet perhaps employs omicron upsilon rho eta alpha sigma, not in the sense of mules, but of sentinels. So, again, of Dolan, ill-favored indeed he was to look upon. It is not meant that his body was ill-shaped, but that his face was ugly, for the Cretans use the word epsilon iota delta epsilon sigma, well-favored, to denote a fair face. Again, zeta omega rho omicron tau epsilon rho omicron nu, delta epsilon, kappa epsilon rho alpha iota epsilon, mix the drink livelier, does not mean "mix it stronger," as for hard drinkers, but mix it quicker. Sometimes an expression is metaphorical, as now all gods and men were sleeping through the night, while at the same time the poet says, often indeed as he turned his gaze to the Trojan plain, he marveled at the sound of flutes and pipes. All is here used metaphorically for many, all being a species of many. So in the verse, alone she hath no part. Omicron iota eta, alone, is metaphorical, for the best known may be called the only one. Again, the solution may depend upon accent or breathing. Thus Hippias of Thasos solved the difficulties in the lines, delta omicron mu epsilon nu, delta omicron mu epsilon nu, delta epsilon, omicron iota, and tau omicron, mu epsilon nu, omicron upsilon, kappa alpha tau alpha pi upsilon theta epsilon tau alpha iota, omicron mu beta rho omega. Or again, the question may be solved by punctuation, as in Empedocles, of a sudden things became mortal that before had learned to be immortal, and things unmixed before mixed. Or again, by ambiguity of meaning, as pi alpha rho omega chi eta kappa epsilon nu, delta epsilon, pi lambda epsilon omega, nu upsilon xi, where the word pi lambda epsilon omega is ambiguous. Or by the usage of language. Thus any mixed drink is called omicron iota nu omicron sigma wine. Hence Ganymede is said to pour the wine to Zeus, though the gods do not drink wine. So two workers in iron are called chi alpha lambda kappa epsilon alpha sigma, or workers in bronze. This, however, may also be taken as a metaphor. Again, when a word seems to involve some inconsistency of meaning, we should consider how many senses it may bear in the particular passage. For example, there was stayed the spear of bronze. We should ask in how many ways we may take being checked there. The true mode of interpretation is the precise opposite of what Glaucon mentions. Critics, he says, jump at certain groundless conclusions. They pass adverse judgment and then proceed to reason on it. And, assuming that the poet has said whatever they happen to think, find fault if a thing is inconsistent with their own fancy. The question about Icarius has been treated in this fashion. The critics imagine he was a Lacedaemonian. They think it strange, therefore, that Telemachus should not have met him when he went to Lacedaemon. But the Cephallenian story may perhaps be the true one. They allege that Odysseus took a wife from among themselves, and that her father was Icadius not Icarius. It is merely a mistake, then, that gives plausibility to the objection. In general, the impossible must be justified by reference to artistic requirements, or to the higher reality, or to received opinion. With respect to the requirements of art, a probable impossibility is to be preferred to a thing improbable and yet possible. Again, it may be impossible that there should be men such as Zeuxis painted. Yes, we say, but the impossible is the higher thing, for the ideal type must surpass the reality. To justify the irrational, we appeal to what is commonly said to be. In addition to which, we urge that the irrational sometimes does not violate reason. Just as, it is probable that a thing may happen contrary to probability. Things that sound contradictory should be examined by the same rules as in dialectical refutation, whether the same thing is meant, in the same relation, and in the same sense. We should therefore solve the question by reference to what the poet says himself, or to what is tacitly assumed by a person of intelligence. The element of the irrational, and, similarly, depravity of character, are justly censured when there is no inner necessity for introducing them. Such is the irrational element in the introduction of Agis by Euripides and the badness of Menelaus in the Orestes. Thus, there are 5 sources from which critical objections are drawn. Things are censured either as impossible, or irrational, or morally hurtful, or contradictory, or contrary to artistic correctness. The answers should be sought under the 12 heads above mentioned. Chapter 26. The question may be raised whether the epic or tragic mode of imitation is the higher. If the more refined art is the higher, and the more refined in every case is that which appeals to the better sort of audience, the art which imitates anything and everything is manifestly most unrefined. The audience is supposed to be too dull to comprehend unless something of their own is thrown in by the performers, who therefore indulge in restless movements. Bad flute players twist and twirl, if they have to represent the quoit throw, or hustle the corypheus when they perform the scylla. Tragedy, it is said, has this same defect. We may compare the opinion that the older actors entertained of their successors. Meniscus used to call Callipides ape, on account of the extravagance of his action, and the same view was held of Pindarus. Tragic art, then, as a whole, stands to epic in the same relation as the younger to the elder actors. So we are told that epic poetry is addressed to a cultivated audience, who do not need gesture; tragedy, to an inferior public. Being then unrefined, it is evidently the lower of the two. Now, in the first place, this censure attaches not to the poetic but to the histrionic art. For gesticulation may be equally overdone in epic recitation, as by Sosistratus, or in lyrical competition, as by Nausithius the Opuntian. Next, all action is not to be condemned any more than all dancing, but only that of bad performers. Such was the fault found in Callipides, as also in others of our own day, who are censured for representing degraded women. Again, tragedy like epic poetry produces its effect even without action. It reveals its power by mere reading. If, then, in all other respects it is superior, this fault, we say, is not inherent in it. And superior it is, because it has all the epic elements. It may even use the epic meter, with the music and spectacular effects as important accessories, and these produce the most vivid of pleasures. Further, it has vividness of impression in reading as well as in representation. Moreover, the art attains its end within narrower limits, for the concentrated effect is more pleasurable than one which is spread over a long time and so diluted. What, for example, would be the effect of the Oedipus of Sophocles, if it were cast into a form as long as the Iliad? Once more, the epic imitation has less unity, as is shown by this, that any epic poem will furnish subjects for several tragedies. Thus if the story adopted by the poet has a strict unity, it must either be concisely told and appear truncated, or, if it conform to the epic canon of length, it must seem weak and watery. Such length implies some loss of unity, if, the poem is constructed out of several actions, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have many such parts, each with a certain magnitude of its own. Yet these poems are as perfect as possible in structure. Each is, in the highest degree attainable, an imitation of a single action. If, then, tragedy is superior to epic poetry in all these respects, and, moreover, fulfills its specific function better as an art, for each art ought to produce, not any chance pleasure, but the pleasure proper to it. As already stated, it plainly follows that tragedy is the higher art, as attaining its end more perfectly. Thus much may suffice concerning tragic and epic poetry in general. Their several kinds and parts, with the number of each and their differences. The causes that make a poem good or bad. The objections of the critics and the answers to these objections.
KaraokeBooks.